Okay, in this video and the next, we're going to spend some time explicating text or analyzing, specific passages from the story, sentences, paragraphs, those sorts of things. And in the first one, I want to talk about similarities that you might see between this story and Hills Like White Elephants. Now, this always seems to happen to me when I put together a syllabus. We read things back to back, or I put stories together, and I put Hills Like White Elephants together with the yellow wallpaper. And there wasn't a whole lot of rhyme or reason to that, but now that I've read these stories in the same week and I've got one in mind as I'm reading the other, I see a lot of similarities. I'll give you a second to start thinking about those. You can pause the video if you want, if you really want to mull it over. But I'm wondering if anyone else saw similarities between the stories. In the previous video, I talked about the feminist angle, if we're going to look at this through a feminist criticism. And I think you can apply that to this story and the previous story, especially when we're looking at gender roles, right? Who's the dominant character, who's the passive character in these stories? In Hills Like White Elephants, it seems to be the man. He's the dominant character, sort of telling the woman what to do. And I think the same thing's happening here, right? I mean, the narrator is basically locked in this room. Not really locked, but she's confined to this room for her rest therapy. And she defers to the man who's making the decisions for her. And that's a little bit general, right? I mean, that's kind of what's happening, but we can also find that being referred to explicitly in the text. I'm not saying that one story is written in response to the another one. I'm just saying that by chance or coincidence, I see a lot of similarities between these two stories. And so if I were a student in this class, maybe I would write a paper comparing and contrasting Hills Like White Elephants with the yellow wallpaper. And so if we're going to do that, here are some points of comparison we could make. If you look on page 473 and 477, we have the use of the word unreasonable or unreasonably or reasonable. And if you remember and you read the David Joss article that talks about Hills Like White Elephants, that word reasonably gets us into the man's mind for a brief instant, right? So in Hills Like White Elephants, the point of view is mostly third person limited, but then we jump into his mind and we have this assessment of other people saying that they are sitting reasonably in the train station. In this story, the author or the narrator says, I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. And there's this portrayal of women as sort of being unreasonable, right? Because that's sort of the implication in Hills Like White Elephants. All of the passengers or the people waiting for the train are reasonable. Why can't Jig be reasonable like them? She's a woman, she's not reasonable. That's sort of the implication that we get from that sentence in the story. Here, I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. I is the narrator, she's a woman, I get unreasonably angry with him. If we look to 477, let me find this. Dear John, he loves me very dearly and hates to have me sick. I tried to have a real, earnest, reasonable talk with him the other day and tell him how I wish he would let me go and make a visit to Cousin Henry and Julia. And again, this word reasonable, right? So she's trying to be reasonable or trying to have a reasonable conversation with him. And that sort of implies that most of her conversations are maybe not reasonable, or at least that he does not see his interactions with her as reasonable. So that's an interesting point of comparison. And it boils down to this one word being used in both stories. But both stories seem to deal with gender roles, right? And I find it really interesting that the idea of who is reasonable or what is reasonable comes together in both of them. In a previous, in the videos for Hills Like White Elephants, I had to correct myself at one time. I referred to the man. We have the man character, right, who is unnamed, and then we have Jig. And at one point I mentioned, well, Jig is a woman, but she's not referred to as a woman in the text, right? She's referred to, as the girl. Said the girl said, those sorts of things. Her dialogue tags say girl, and the man say man. And I found it interesting here, and in that story that sort of diminishes her, right? We have the man who's an adult, but then Jig is sort of portrayed as a girl, right? And on page 478 in this story, where are we? I got up softly and went to feel and see if the paper did move, and when I came back, John was awake. So she'd been lying in the bed, sort of staring at the wallpaper. Finally, she gets up to feel it. What is it, little girl, he said. Don't go walking like that, you'll get cold. And so, what is it, little girl? And so he's referring to her as a girl. He's married to her. She's really a woman, but he's referring to her as a girl, right? And so in a way, he's diminishing her power or her authority. And so again, in the first example, we had things coming down to the use of the word choice of reasonable or unreasonable. And here the word girl tells us a lot of things, right? It tells us what the characters think about each other. And actually, if we look back at Hills Like White Elephants, it tells us what the narrator is thinking about Jig, right? Because we think that that narrator is sort of impartial, but the use of the word girl sort of aligns the narrator more with the man, right? Because the man is kind of thinking of her as a girl and not as a woman. And so that's another point of comparison that I think is interesting here. Not saying, again, that these stories are written to each other, but I do see similarities and I find them really interesting because they both seem to deal with gender roles. And then finally, if we're looking at 478 later on that same page, the narrator's talking about going home. She doesn't like being in this house. She doesn't like being in the room with the damn wallpaper. She wants to go home. This is the husband's response. The repairs are not done at home, and I cannot possibly leave town just now. Of course, if you were in any danger, I could and would, but you are really better, dear, whether you can see it or not. I am a doctor, dear, and I know. Does that sound like anything from Hills Like White Elephants? Over and over, the man in that story is telling her it's a simple procedure, it's a simple operation. People do it all the time. They come out happy. And he's sort of presuming to know something that he really doesn't know. And here again we have the male character pressuring the female character to do or not do something. And that's just another one of those similarities that I see between this story, The Yellow Wallpaper, and the previous story, Hills Like White Elephants. So, that might be something that I would try to build a paper on. Now, I've only pulled out 3 quotes, but there might be more quotes, 3 or 4 quotes actually. There might be more quotes from this story that you could pull in and compare to the previous story, but that might be enough to build a paper on. So just things to think about as you move forward. But yeah, I see a lot of similarities between these two, and I just wanted to share those with you.